to Discograffiti, the deep dive podcast for music obsessives that gives maniacs like you and me the chance to connect with a brotherhood obsessed with rating the entire discography of every single artist and band that ever mattered. I'm your host, Dave Gebroe, and when I was a kid, I thought I loved music. But no, that was only the beginning. I almost lost my life, and in the process, it made music a top priority in a way I'd thought was completely unimaginable. I quit my job, went all in on Discograffiti, and never looked back. And so, with 3 new episodes each week, you're going to gain a comprehensive knowledge of an act's history and output in the time it takes to listen to one album. Each new guest swings a hard left into an area you either had no idea you needed to know about, or know all about and can't believe you're not alone out there. And in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on love! Along with our special guest, Johnny Echols. This episode is part of a series called 7 and 7 and 7 is, the definitive 21-episode story of Arthur Lee and Love, which I've consciously crafted to act as the ultimate repository of fact and opinion on one of the greatest bands to ever walk the face of the earth, the almighty Love. It includes 13 episodes heralding the return of Discograffiti host OG Joe Kennedy, 6 episodes from a 4.5-hour interview with OG Love mainstay Johnny Echols, and 2 episodes from a 2.5-hour interview with the members of Baby Lemonade, who've served as Love now for coming up on 35 years. This is part 8, the 4th part of my interview with Johnny Echols, which covers the same time period as episode 7, but in more granular detail and heard directly from the man who lived it. Part 8 covers Love's forever changes, the machinations behind the scenes, the making of the record, and all the classic music on it. Here are just a few of the many things that Johnny discusses with Discograffiti in this podcast. Why Arthur thought he was going to die after making Love's 3rd record, Arthur's relationship with cocaine at that time, the secret that Arthur kept from the band members during the making of the album, whether Neil Young had any production involvement as legend has had it, Johnny's thoughts on orchestrator David Angel's contribution to the LP, his true thoughts about turning down Monterey Pop, what Johnny thinks is his best ever moment on record, finally that all of God's children gotta have their freedom piece at the end of The Red Telephone is explained, and an in-depth track-by-track deep dive with Johnny on Forever Changes, plus his own star rating on the record. And away we go then! I want to ask you, because now we're at Forever Changes, here's a big question I've always had and I never understood. Why did Arthur Lee think he was going to die after Forever Changes? It's not like the guy received a cancer diagnosis or anything. So why was he walking around thinking that he was going to imminently pass away and that your 3rd record was going to be his last will and testament?
Well, Arthur was clinically bipolar. He had been diagnosed as bipolar. And he had been they had given him lithium. And during that period, the lithium was not agreeing with him and he was feeling horrible. And so he started using cocaine more. And that's the last thing a bipolar person should have is cocaine. And so it's just, he's starting, I mentioned that before and I hope it sounded, it's not nearly as negative as it may have come off. The fact that Arthur was using drugs, but he was using more drugs than we were. And he was using, during that period of time, cocaine quite a bit. He was always high. And he was doing so, I think, to escape the fact that he's getting adulation and acclaim that he knows in his heart is not warranted. And so he's trying to escape from that life or whatever, that reality that people have kind of foisted upon him. Because when we started, we were a group, we were friends, we loved each other, we were buddies, but slowly and slowly, he began to move away from us and more into this caricature of who he thought he should be as a rock star, and he became moody and hard to get along with. But as I mentioned before, a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's bipolar. So he has these peaks and troughs. And when he's in a peak, he's just on top of the world. But when he's in a trough, it's just life is horrible. He's going to die at any minute. and he's using cocaine, which makes you paranoid as hell. So when he gets into a trough on cocaine, it's just dire. Everything is horrible, and he just sees blackness. And so at that point, when we were doing that, he had a secret, and we'll discuss that secret, that I didn't know at the time. Nobody knew until we got to the studio. And then it all just came tumbling out. And then, from there, that's how everything unfolded. It just kind of...
What secret? That you mean that he was going to die, or?
No. The secret was he had been telling Brian. Brian and I were upset. We were upset that we were not getting credit for stuff that we did. I wrote songs. Brian wrote songs. We wanted to have our material on these albums. And so we were getting to the point, remember I mentioned that I was with Henry and we were thinking about, starting a blues band. So I'm of a mind, let's do that. So let's just make this our last album. And Arthur has us convinced that he has spoken to Jack Holzman, and Jack has green-lighted the fact that one side would be Brian's material, one side would be mine, and the two sides of the double album would be Arthur. And so we were all agreed to that. Everything was cool. And we get to the studio and it changes. Now Arthur's telling us that Elektra has reneged on their promises and that we won't be doing a double album. Well, Arthur's secret was it was bullshit all along. He had Brian and I believing that we were going to do a double album only to keep us together so we could go in and record it. So I think all of that just kind of was weighing on him, and he just saw doom and gloom, as his future.
Wow.
But yeah, that was so shocking because I, to this day, still have, was he totally lying? Did he talk to Jack Holzman? Did Jack tell him no? Did Jack tell him maybe? What was the story? And Jack has never told me.
Well, Jack swears up and down that we were a small record label. We would never have agreed to a double album because that wasn't a thing that we could have afforded.
That's what I believe, too, because they told us it was too expensive. So I'm sure he presented it to him because I don't think Arthur would have thought of that, the fact that this would be an expensive proposition for a smaller label, even though at that point the Doors are taking off. But then again, they're borrowing money. They're expanding. They're borrowing money against the Doors' success. So they can't afford, I think we both had billboards in Hollywood, and those billboards were expensive as hell, and that Elektra paid for. So, I do at some point, if I ever speak to him again, I do owe him an apology for that because I blamed him. And it wasn't his fault. It wasn't Jack Holzman's fault. It was, Arthur trying to keep something together that was on the verge of falling apart. And he wanted to milk as much as he could out of it by bullshitting Brian and I into thinking that we were going to do a double album when he knew full well that that wasn't going to happen.
Right.
So when we get to the studio, and then of all things, Neil Young is there. Now, I couldn't stand Neil Young. Still don't like him. Neil Young is a wonderful musician. Love his songs. But him as a person, I just don't like. There are people in this world that you just are at loggerheads with all the time. Neil and I are like that. I'm sure he feels the same way about me. We just don't like each other. And so there he is, and he's going to produce Forever Changes Now. We get high with Neil. As I said, I don't like him, but hey, if you smoke dope with him. So we smoked with him and hung with him. He was around all the time. We saw him. But there's no way in hell we're going to listen to him as a producer. So we started laughing. And, turns out Bruce Botnick had brought Neil in because Neil was on the verge of losing his house or his apartment, and he needed money. He was in desperate shape. So getting producers' money would have, helped his financial situation. So Bruce Botnick thought he had the pull to do that. It turns out he didn't. So soon as we see Neil Young, we laugh and stuff. And Neil is there for a few minutes and he leaves. So he has nothing whatsoever to do with the album other than he was at the studio for a few minutes.
So tell me about Alone Again Or's transformation in your hands from a folk song to a much more Spanish-inflected piece. Was it obvious to you what to do with that as a piece of material? All right, that concludes your free sneak peek into today's bonus episode. If you want to hear the rest of it, just visit patreon.com/discograffiti and either purchase this podcast by itself for $4, or better yet, subscribe at the major tier and get access to Discograffiti's 3 weekly episodes. That's Friday's main episode, the Sunday Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. That's our podcast within a podcast featuring Patreon members as guests, and your Tuesday bonus episode. Please keep in mind this is entirely how I support my wife and 7-year-old son, so don't risk feeling badly about yourself by not supporting Discograffiti. Become a member so you don't miss a single thing at patreon.com/discograffiti.